Welcome to part 2 of this interview. If you haven't yet checked out part 1, the link will be in the description. Sit back, relax, and enjoy. You are listening to the Lichatchila River podcast. Welcome to part 2. Yankel, good to have you back. We ended off saying how you ended off in yeshiva and in Chabad, and you're there until you're married.
Okay, great. A few things happened when I came back. One of the things that I was really adamant about in my learning was I really wanted to know what exactly the Rebbe was saying. So I didn't want anybody to tell me what the Rebbe was saying because I felt like that filter skews the Rebbe's words towards the view of whoever it is that's translating it, right? So what I did was I took the Milon Likutei Sichos, the Likutei Sichos dictionary, and I took Chelik Aleph and Beis, and every single week I would go over and type every single word from one Sicha from that week, and then I would print it. Like I would type it up on a computer and have it side by side with the original Yiddish, and I had one of the rabbis in the yeshiva would go over it, and he even wrote a summary at the end, and through doing that, I taught myself Yiddish so that I could understand what the Rebbe was saying in the Rebbe's own words. And after learning in yeshiva for about 2 years total, I felt like now was the time for me to get married. So I asked my mashpia, I wrote a letter in the Igris, and the response that I got back was, don't let Yerushalayim break up the young couple. So I understood that the Rebbe is giving me, my mashpia told me, the Rebbe is giving you a bracha to get married. So go, start looking. And one of the other mashpiim in the yeshiva, he played a very interesting trick on me at one point. And he called me to his office right before Zal. And he told me there's a man who's going to come to Kfar Chabad and he doesn't know where the bookstore is. Could you please escort him to the bookstore? Now, this was so weird because this was the guy who was like, if you're not in Zal, you're in big trouble. And all of a sudden, he's telling me, go take some guy to a bookstore in the middle of Zal. Like, something felt off to me. I couldn't exactly put my finger on what it was, but something felt really off. But on the other hand, he was my mashpia, so I agreed, okay, fine. I guess I'll do what you ask, Bittul Torah, but you got to have covered rabbanim. So I did it. So I meet this guy, and we're walking to the bookstore. He doesn't want to go to 770 bookstore. He wants to go to the other bookstore, which is a farther walk. And he's speaking to me in broken English. He's telling me I have a son who's learning in yeshiva in Miami. I have 10 kids, and he's telling me about his family a little bit. One of my sons is a very famous photographer in Chabad. Okay, I'm, taking in all this information, and he's asking me questions about my life. And then we get to the bookstore, and in this particular bookstore I think it's called Chish in Kfar Chabad, all of the English books that I was interested in were like on a very elevated level of the store, like not on eye level. You actually had to climb up a ladder. So I climb up this ladder, and I'm looking for a particular book. And after a few minutes, the guy that I was melave tells me, okay, I'm ready to go. So I walked him back, more small talk, blah, blah, blah. A few days later, my mashpia calls me again into his office, and he says, I have a shidduch for you. And I asked him, to tell me a little bit about this girl. And he tells me it sounds very interesting, very promising. And he suggests that we meet in Bnei Brak. Was where we met for the first time. Now, I don't know if you or anybody else is particularly familiar, but Bnei Brak is not exactly known for loving Chabad Chassidim, and particularly Chabad Chassidim who wear, a Degel Mashiach like I was wearing at that time. It was like, it almost felt like dangerous to walk into Bnei Brak, almost like the feeling of going into Harlem nowadays. Not ad kedei kach, but, lahavdil, Elef Abdullah, kind of like that. At least that's how I felt about it. if I walk into Bnei Brak, I'm going to get into a fight. But whatever. Anyway, fine. We meet in Bnei Brak. We're going to meet in Bnei Brak. And right before I get on the bus, I asked my mashpia, by the way, does she speak English? So he tells me enough and, pushes me onto the bus, essentially. I get on the bus. I go to Bnei Brak, and he sent me with a map. This was before smartphones. And I just had a printed out paper of a map of how to get from the bus stop to the meeting place. We were supposed to meet in an old widow's house. So he mapped it out perfectly. I was supposed to go to Rav Ashi Street, and I go to the address exactly like he wrote, and I knock on the door, and nobody answers the door. I knocked again. Maybe the widow can't hear me. She's very old. I don't know. I have no idea what's going on. Nobody answers. So I waited for a few minutes. No one's answering the door. I tried calling my mashpia to tell him, like, hey, why isn't anybody answering? And he must have thought, oh my God, he saw the girl. He doesn't want her and he wants to get out of there. So he's calling me. So he didn't answer me either. So this was like, I had a flip phone, and my flip phone is like starting to die. I kept calling him like 1,000 times, no answer. Nobody's answering the door. And finally, I guess somebody on their side called him, and they were like, where is this guy? What's he doing? And it turned out that he actually sent me to the wrong place. Instead of sending me to Rav Asi Street, he sent me to Rav Ashi Street. So then he had to direct me with the little battery that I had left to get to the correct place. And I finally got there, and I arrived about an hour late. And it turns out that the girl that I'm about to meet does not speak a word of English farther than hello. And so now I am 3 years into Yiddishkeit, right? And even though I was living at the time in Kfar Chabad, but like we didn't really have all that much to do with people who didn't speak English in Kfar Chabad, and they didn't have all that much to do with us. Like I would go to the supermarket, I know how to say Toda Rabah, and that's about the extent of what like my speaking Hebrew was at that moment. But while I'm sitting there on a date with my future wife, I am like racking my brain to remember all of the Maimarim I ever learned and try to string together sentences enough to have a coherent enough conversation. And, somehow, I guess she found that kind of charming. And we spoke for like 5 hours in broken Hebrew on the first date. And when it was over, I thought for sure, like, there's no way that she wants to see me again. Like we're talking in hand motions, but somehow, some way she agreed to a second date. And so I practiced my Hebrew a little bit more, and, it got better progressively each time that we met. And eventually I asked her, Aim ata rotzeh litchaten iti? And she agreed to get married, even though I asked her in the masculine form and not in the feminine, but she agreed to get married. So yeah, it was an interesting journey, and we got married, thank God, and we were trying to figure out where to live. She wanted to live in Yerushalayim. Okay, remember the Rebbe's letter. She wanted to live in Yerushalayim, and this was actually like a big sticking point. Every time that I wanted to live in Kfar Chabad because I wanted to keep going to the yeshiva after we got married, and she wanted to live in Yerushalayim. And after every date, she would agree in front of my face, yes, okay, fine, we'll live in Kfar Chabad or somewhere else. But then she would go home and she kept saying Yerushalayim. So eventually, my mashpia had to step in and say, listen, under no circumstance should they live in Yerushalayim. And he had a whole Kabbalah of why, from his mashpia, that it was not a good idea to live in Yerushalayim. And that's what he extended to me. And if you remember what the Rebbe's letter said, don't let Yerushalayim break up the couple. It was mamish, amazing Ruach HaKodesh that was on display, and she eventually agreed to live outside of Yerushalayim, which was a pretty good decision at the time.
The letter should mean Yusha Bittel to go to Yerushalayim. How does the letter to you apply to her? That's my shayla.
Well, I would have had Bittel to go to Yerushalayim, except that my mashpia told me he saw the letter and he said, under no circumstances should you live in Yerushalayim. He understood that, one party doesn't want to live in Yerushalayim and one party does, but don't let that break up the couple. So somebody's going to have to give, and it wasn't me. That's what, I personally, I would have been okay with it if that's what my mashpia told me. If he said, listen, Yankel, the Rebbe's letter means you have to go live in Yerushalayim, I would have done it. But he told me the opposite. So I listened to my mashpia, and azoy geitas. So we settled on trying to live in Kfar Chabad, but it's not so simple. So we ended up living in Bnei Brak. How fun.
Oh my gosh. Was that better than Yerushalayim?
From what yeah, according to what he said, yes. And also because he himself lived in Bnei Brak. So, we're talking about Rabbi Gafni. It's not a simple Pashter person that, has narrow shoulders. He's got broad shoulders, and he knew what he was doing. And so he himself was in Bnei Brak, and I would travel with him back and forth to the yeshiva every day. So I think it worked out pretty well. So after we got married, I asked Rabbi Gafni, what should I do for Parnasa? So he told me, you have two choices, because I wasn't an Israeli citizen. I didn't want to become one because then they would probably draft me to the army, and that would create a whole different set of, a situation that I wasn't really, I didn't really want to deal with, like holding an M16, for example. I been there, done that. Let's put it that way. So he said, and then he says to me, you have two choices. You can either be a sefer or a sheikhet. And again, when it comes to blood, been there, done that. I didn't really want to be around that all the time. So I passed on being a sheikhet, and I decided to be a sefer, and I learned Safras, and I, started to dabble in that. And it didn't really work out all that well for me when we were living in Eretz Yisrael. And to make a long story short, we eventually decided that after 2 children and a third on the way, the right move would be to move from Eretz Yisrael and come to America. And that this was the place that, I would find more success than Eretz Yisrael, and that wasn't really working out all that well. Okay, so I got to America. I was working in a Safras place, and I very grateful for that opportunity. I got to grow in terms of Safras. I put in a lot of hours into the field of Safras. However, here's the juice. I didn't feel fulfilled. I didn't feel like I was living the life that I was supposed to be living. There's a famous Hayem Yem about somebody who is meant to be a diamond, a jewelry maker, and he's baking bread instead, then he's doing an Aveira kilu. That's what the Hayem Yem says. And the same goes vice versa. If you're not in the right spot, then you're doing the wrong thing, so to speak. And I didn't feel like Safras was really where I belong, because, we've been talking for over an hour about my life story, and I could go on for another 3 hours about my life story. And I feel like that is my tafkid in this world, is to be involved in helping people, especially people who can avoid the same problems that I myself ran into, and using, the experiences that God saw to put me through to make the world a better place, kipshute. And I wasn't feeling it with Safras, but I had no idea really how to go about doing that, how to make that change in my own life. And I was very, timid and scared, just afraid of what that would actually look like. And one day I was in the mikveh and I met a very dear friend of mine who was also a sefer mumche, and that was Fitz Rabin. And he tells me, I just got into coaching and I would love to have a conversation with you. I had no clue what coaching was at the time. I mean, I can imagine, I played sports on sports teams, throughout my whole childhood, and I know what coaches are in that kind of sense, but I had no idea what the field of coaching in this context was. And so I kind of like brushed it off a little bit until it got to the point where, like, there's a saying in the Gemara that Rabbi Gafni once told me, and he said, once the Rebbe made a spontaneous Farbrengen on Tesvav Shvat, and when the Chassidim were sitting at the Farbrengen, the Rebbe said, the reason why I made this Farbrengen is because when I was at the Oyel of the Frierdiker Rebbe, there was a fire underneath my wings, which is it's a quote from the Gemara. Like, I was compelled to do so. So at a certain point, I felt like I must do something. I'm feeling stuck in what I'm doing, and I'm not feeling like I'm living my tafkid in the world, and I have to do something. And I remembered that my dear friend, Fitz, told me about what he was doing, and I decided that I wanted to have a conversation with him. And inside of my conversation with Fitz, we spoke 3 times at length before I decided to either go on with it or drop it. And every single conversation was deeper than the last, and it brought my entire worldview into question. That was what he was doing through his conversation with me. He was questioning whether or not my beliefs were really realities or whether or not they were imaginary boxes that I created for myself. And the more that I looked into it, the more I realized that all of the reasons that I claimed were legitimate for why I can't be a public speaker or why I can't be, somebody who is helping people and living, what I felt was my purpose, and why I couldn't sell my safras for more money and support my family better than I was doing at the time, were all simply made up walls that I created in my mind that stopped me from living the life that I really wanted to live. And as the further in that we got, the more those walls started to disintegrate in front of my eyes, and I would just go out and do the thing. Like, one of my dreams has always been to write a book, particularly a memoir. And so through my coaching work, I decided to hire a very high-end editor, and she helped me to write what is the beginning of my memoir. Like something that, it was just stuttering. It wasn't going anywhere until I decided to actually take action and do something about it, which I just didn't even imagine was a possibility before I started working with Fitz. And the same was true for getting speaking engagements. I spoke in different yeshivas all of a sudden, and different Chabad houses, places where, like, I just couldn't dream that I would end up. One Shabbos is 250 people at a Chabad house, like, beyond my dreams.
Wow. So what was the biggest breakthrough? Was it a process, or was it like one day? Like, what was it mainly the action you took?
Nobody needs coaching, and I didn't need coaching. I wanted coaching, and therefore to this day I still have a coach because I enjoy it. But it's kind of like when you become exposed to a certain level of elikus. At a certain point, when that level becomes the status quo, you realize that there's another level beyond that you weren't aware of 2 steps before because it was too far away, right? So now that I have gotten to this particular level, whatever level it is that I have gotten to, there is another level for me to get to that I want to strive for, right? Because we're always attempting to grow. We want to get to a more elevated space, a more panemius type space. So some things were like light bulb moments, like, oh my God, I can't believe that I didn't see that. And other things were more like, okay, this feels to me like I am Nachshon ben Aminadab, and I'm about to go, jump into, like, take a dive into the Yam Suf, and I'm not really ready for that. So I'll dip my toe in a little bit, and then my coach will, push me a little bit further and push me a little bit further. And eventually I'll get to the point where, the sea splits.
So what kind of, with people you worked with, what kind of like results have you seen? What, there is a story or a certain example you could like share?
Sure. I'll do my
Yeah.
best to, conceal the identities of the people. I was working with a guy who came to me because he heard a podcast that I was on, and it happens to be that he's not part of our community, a different sect of Yiddishkeit, but he really enjoyed the podcast. Somebody introduced it to him, and he called me up and asked me, if we could meet. Okay. And the very first time that we met, he had a whole spiel about when he was young, his Rebbe would yell at him if the straps of his tefillin touched the floor. And so he decided that now, he's grown and not, he can make his own choices. He's just going to not put on tefillin altogether because he hates it. Every time he sees a pair of tefillin, all he can think about is the Rebbe that's yelling at him for the straps touching the floor. Okay, so I asked him, what if, as a possibility, not a definite, just a possibility, what if the tefillin straps touching the floor doesn't actually mean that? It doesn't actually mean that because in his mind, he equated, okay, my tefillin straps touch the floor, so I did an Avera, and it's like I didn't even put on tefillin, so why put on tefillin? So I asked him, what if in your mind it wasn't actually like that? What if it was just putting on tefillin? What if it didn't have all of that extra meaning that you carry with you when you actually go and put on tefillin? And it took him a little while to realize that actually tefillin is just tefillin, and what happened to him is what happened to him, but they're not the same and intertwined. And so I challenged him to spend a week just putting on tefillin without worrying whether or not the straps touched the floor and if he did it or didn't do it. He just put it on. And he took me up on the challenge and sent me a tefillin selfie every single day for a week. Then there was another guy who came into my office, and also not of our community. And when I asked him what he was doing, why are you here? What do you want? And he started talking, and in such a way that, I don't know if you've ever heard, but people who they're talking a lot, but they're not actually saying anything. You ever met somebody like that?
Yeah, I'm saying all the time. Not much to that extent.
So he was just saying a lot of words that sounded nice together in a sentence, but had absolutely no meaning whatsoever. So I said to him after about 5 minutes of listening to him talk about nothing, I said, listen, if we are going to continue this conversation, cut the fluff, because I have no clue what you're talking about. Cut the fluff. And he sent me a message. That was like 3 years ago. He sent me a message 2 weeks ago. I keep in touch with him, even though we're not working together anymore. He said, you should know that when you said to me, cut the fluff, that really helped me to understand how to communicate with people. 3 years later, he sent me that message. He said, I still think about that.
Wow.
And apparently for him, it's really, working, because he is communicating much better. And even when I speak to him now, it's like a totally different person, just talking to the point and not all of this puffery and fakeness that he had been doing, until now. It was just a real direct conversation, which really helped him improve in his business, in his marriage.
Will accomplish, or won't accomplish, or what can someone expect from it? Each guy's Lafinyane, or it's like there's a certain framework of what they're accomplishing?
Personally, I don't know how, other coaches work, but personally for me, each person is his own world, his own project. It vastly depends on what exactly they're trying to accomplish through their coaching, right? I don't think it would be correct for me to impose some kind of agenda on what it is that they should be working on, even if I see it. I can point it out, but some people are, might not be willing to go there. They don't want to, or whatever the reason may be, but I let it kind of flow in an organic way. But some people, it looks like more success in business. Some people, it looks like a better shalom bayis. Some people, it looks like a better relationship with their children. Some people, it looks like all three. It really depends vastly on the person who's sitting across from you and kind of what they're willing to reveal and how deep they're willing to go into the blockages that are stopping them from having the relationships that they do want.
Yes, you mentioned your book before. From your book, if you want to take out a few nuggets from the book, what do you think would be the most useful here to share?
Well, let me clarify that there's two things going on at the same time. One is that I started to write a memoir about my life, but that's not published as of yet because I'm very adamant that I want that to go to through the proper channels of an agent and a publishing house. And my dream is that it should one day become a movie. That would be amazing. So that's on hold for the moment, because I'm still waiting for the agent part, which is, complicated to find and get and whatever. But at the same time, I actually did publish a book of my own that is a book about coaching. So one of my favorite lines that I came up with in the book is beating ourselves up without producing the results is far easier than loving ourselves despite the results. So I'll break it down for you. Usually what happens is, and this is extremely common, right? Somebody who tries at something and is not successful. So they say to themselves, okay, well, look, I tried at something and I failed. Therefore, I must be a loser, right? It's far easier to adapt that attitude, which is super common, than it is to love yourself despite the results, to love yourself despite the fact that you failed, or regardless of whether or not you failed or succeeded, right? It's so much easier to go directly into the beating yourself up stage than it is to the loving stage. And that is something that I find as a theme across all of the people that I've worked with and a lot of humanity. If you listen carefully to what people are saying and the way people say it, particularly when they're talking about themselves, you can see that a lot of people are in serious lack of self-love or compassion and are just extremely, extremely judgmental of themselves. And that also causes them to be judgmental of others. Those feelings usually lead to bitterness and unhappiness. That is ultimately what people are trying to solve for. If you're unsuccessful, they want to get successful so that they can be happy, even though that in itself is a lie. Or if they're successful, then they ask themselves, well, how come I'm not happy? What exactly am I waiting for to become happy? If you haven't gotten married, why am I not happy? If you are married, why am I not happy? I'm not happy because I don't have kids. When you have kids, I'm not happy because I have kids. People, it's like a very elusive thing that people are trying to find, kiviyachol, and that is so-called moment of peace. When does it end and I can just be satisfied? And if you break that down further, it really comes from a lack of self-compassion and self-love. I created a book in order that when I meet with somebody for the first time, ideally, they would have already read the book and therefore elevate the level of conversation that we're going to have, right? Because people who have no clue what coaching is, they have no idea what they're getting themselves into, like the guy with the cut the fluff. And conversation level takes place in their realm, the realm in which they currently find themselves, which is usually on a lower level, or otherwise they probably wouldn't be sitting in a coach's office, most likely, right? So I wanted to be able to elevate the level of conversation to a higher level. And so I created a book that takes somebody through, essentially through the coaching process, 15 or so different topics of coaching that if you are a person who is interested in coaching, you could read this and say to yourself, this sounds like something that I want to do. And therefore, when you have the conversation with a potential coach, you're already not at the same place you were before you read the book. And I also created it for a coach to use as a guide of whether or not prospective client is going to be a good client or a bad client by asking him to read the book. And at the end of every chapter, there's a few questions. So if the client answers the questions, then you can guess that in the future, when you ask him to step out of whatever box he's in, he's likely to do it. So I kind of created it as like a two-way street for coaches and clients both to use that would be beneficial to them, to elevate the conversation and to figure out whether or not, the client is actually ready for coaching, because some people just are not, and that's okay. But they're not ready to yet take the steps that would be required to really get to the level of success that they want. I've met lots of people like that, and totally fine.
So my question is, tell you wrote some post the other day about the whole entire life you went through so much challenges. Like you found coaching, that's when you feel like you mamish broke free from like limitations. What was a chiddush of coaching more than like, I'm sure you spoke to different therapists. What's mamish the chiddush?
Therapy, if you've ever been in therapy, or anybody who's listening to this has ever been in therapy, it's really not about the uftu at all. In fact, the opposite. Better you sit in your cholent. That's okay. Sit in it. I mean, I'm not knocking therapy. I'm just saying that that's more the goal, is to let it stew. And coaching is very much the opposite of that. It's more like, okay, so let's just say for a second that you were at one time in your life a victim. Let's say, are you a victim now in this moment? Well, no, I'm not a victim in this moment. Okay, great. So what are you going to do about it? What are you going to do so that you're to show or to live the experience of not being a victim? Because if you really look at it, the way I had been living, I'll give you an example from my own life, right? Even though I had become a chassid, and even though, and all of the things, and quit, left a horrible life behind and became a chassid, got married, had kids, lived in America. Even though all of that, I was still living with the mentality of somebody who is, a victim. In the moment when I decided that, I don't have what it takes to speak in a yeshiva. Who am I to speak in a yeshiva? That is not the mentality that I really want to embody. That's a mentality of somebody who is small and pashit, a victim. And what really changed for me is like, okay, so again, you were victimized in your past, right? You've gotten beaten up, you got stabbed, plenty of bad stuff happened to you. But is that happening to you in this current moment, right now? Yankel Meislin, living in Crown Heights, are you a victim right now? No. So why are you living like you are? Why can't you go to a yeshiva and speak and coach Bachrim and whoever, anybody in this world? Why can't you? And that was like, whoa, for me. Why am I living as a victim if I'm not?
So what gave you the answer to take action?
Well, first of all, to realize that I had been living as a victim secretly, right? Like in the recesses of my mind, that took a while to get to that understanding. It wasn't like,
even the hair, that's already
that was already something, yeah, right. Because at least it put light on what was going on. There's another ayim where the Rebbe says the person who's really sick is the one who doesn't even know he's sick, right? So the first step, absolute minimum, is to figure out what is going on. So that was good. And then after that, like, okay, so now what? Good. You're not you don't want to live as a victim, and the truth is, Taki, you're not a victim. So what are you going to do about it? And so what did I do? I went on a podcast. I spoke in yeshivas. I offered my services to Batei Chabad. I did it.
Do you find Chassidus and this coaching the same mentality?
Somebody who learns and lives Chassidus would have this mentality built in to them. I think we all have it built into us. However, we also have the concerns of the world. Like, fortunately, people have a yesh, and that yesh that they have comes with fears of rejection, fears of failure, all kinds of different, some more overt fears, some more covert fears, Does a chassid have those kinds of things, like somebody who's really living that? I suppose that a chassid, like somebody who's really, really, really a chassid, I guess, would already have that. They already live that. But as a good example of like chassidus that goes hand in hand or synonymous with coaching, I think two things come to mind. The story where the woman asked the Rebbe, how come you don't get tired after standing for so many hours? And the Rebbe said, you don't get tired counting diamonds, right? But who saw the diamonds? Did we see the diamonds? Do we see our diamonds? Do you consider yourself a diamond? Or was the Rebbe just really kiviyachol, me'erer, not kiviyachol, kipshute, me'erer, the diamonds in every person who passed by him, right? But our fleshik eyes Do we see that? Do you consider that every yid that you come into contact with at all moments is a diamond? I don't, personally. I would, in theory, I do, right? But one of the things that the Rebbe drives home very strongly is the Poyo Mamish, right? It's not, good, you have in theory. Rabbi Gafni once told me a story. One of his Talmidim used to stand in the back of 770. And in Mem Aleph, when the Rebbe came out with Sivas Hashem, and we want Mashiach now, so the Rebbe would pass by this Talmid, and he would hold the door open for the Rebbe, going out of the big Zal downstairs. And he said to the Rebbe, we want Mashiach now. And the Rebbe said to him, yes, but I don't mean it as a slogan. So it's one thing to think, in theory, we're all diamonds, but it's a totally another thing to mine a diamond. And another thing that comes to mind that's really pertinent, I think, is, the Ayem Yem, Teres Baal Shem Tev, Estate Ki Tiyu Atem Eretz Chafetz Amar Hashem Svakes. Ata Zoi Vi, die Greste Chachamim, wel in Ebek nit der Gain, die Größe Tvies Dicke Eitzreis, welch Hashem Yisparech hat Teva gewend Baaretz, als Hakol Hayamin Haafar. Ata Zoi ken keiner nit der Gain, die Größe Eitzreis, was liegen in Jeden. Was sie seien dem Eberstens Baruchu Eretz Chafetz. Besiem Baal Shem Tev, ich will machen von Jeden, als sie sollen geben dem Yivu, was dem Ebersten Baruchu Eretz Chafetz can geben. To me, that's like the essence of what I try to do, is to mine as much as possible out of the person who's sitting across from me all of the amazing qualities that have been hidden under their, the things that are holding them back and the reason why they're not megala those things. And slowly peel back the layers until you can get to the Eretz Chafetz, the Galui.
Yeah, so where can people find you best?
I'm on LinkedIn, Yankel Meislin. I'm on Twitter, Yankel Meislin 770. I'm on Instagram, but I don't really use it that much. You can just send me a WhatsApp on my phone. If you want the number, ask Chaim. He'll give it to you.
Yeah, you can email us at
igniteyourflamecoaching@gmail.com.
And the book is called The Journey to Oz.
The book is called The Journey to Oz. I mean, it's a play on words on the Wizard of Oz. You ever heard of that movie? No, of course you haven't. You're a Chassid Shabachar.
No, I've heard the name. I don't know what it is, but I heard the name.
Yeah, okay. So The Wizard of Oz was a movie that came out many, many, many years ago, I think in the 30s or 40s, about a girl who gets lost and she finds some weird friends along the way, and each of them have some kind of chisarim. And they heard that there's this wizard who lives in a big tower, and he can basically make you whole and grant you wishes. And so they come across all these kinds of nisyanis along the way, on their way to get to the wizard. And once they get to the wizard helps them realize that actually all the things that you thought were chaser b'cha were actually inside of you the whole time. They just needed to be revealed. So that's why I called the book The Journey to Oz. Because in the end, it's all there. Just like the Baal Shem Tov said, Lahavdil, you need to find it. I guess that would be my message.
Oh, yeah, and your website again? What's your website?
igniteyourflamecoaching.com.
Okay. I'll put that in the links, in the show note links also. And it's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Chaim.
If you made it here if you're listening to this, you made it till the end, then kol hakavod.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, thank you, Yankel. Thanks for the time, and reach out to him for any questions, and maybe if you want to bring him down to your yeshiva or to your Chabad house or any speaking engagements or to any other questions or opportunities. Okay.
Thank you, Chaim. Thanks for having me.
Oh, okay. Yeah. A pleasure. Thank you for listening to the Lechatchila Adira podcast. Subscribe to us on YouTube and leave us a follow on Spotify. If you enjoyed this episode, please smash that like button and leave us a 5-star review.